We met, and the Prime Minister of Canada, President of Mexico, and we spoke for a half hour. Very good, very productive. Talked mostly trade.
Will you restart negotiations with Canada?
Look, I have a great relationship with Canada. They're very tough traders, but I have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister and with Canada.
But you had said you would halt those negotiations earlier after the tariff.
Well, I have halted them.
And so will you restart them?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, the problem is Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also. But we'll work it out. Look, Canada's a special place, and they really are good at ice hockey, aren't they?
Mr. President.
President Donald Trump didn't need anyone to challenge him. His own words told the story. Asked whether he would restart trade negotiations with Canada, the president simply replied, "We'll see." In that short hesitation lies the truth about the North American landscape in 2025. The United States is improvising its way through a turbulent trade environment, while Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is building stability, direction, and global reach. Tonight, we break down how one casual exchange at the Kennedy Center reveals something far bigger. Canada has a coherent strategy. Trump does not. At the Kennedy Center, Trump spoke about everything from Elton John to UFC fights to Hollywood mergers. The atmosphere was light and off the cuff until someone mentioned Canada. Trump boasted that his meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney had been very productive, but then admitted he had halted trade negotiations. When pressed on whether he would restart talks, his answer was the familiar ambiguity that has defined his second term. "Yeah, we'll see." Then came the line that raised eyebrows across both borders. Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also. Moments later, he shifted to talking about hockey. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, a discussion about the future of continental trade. On the other, a sports joke. The imbalance and seriousness spoke for itself. And this exchange didn't happen in isolation. It came at a time when Trump's administration is under intense pressure at home, from legal challenges over tariff authority to corporations openly revolting against the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy. In that wider context, Trump's dismissive tone toward Canada sounded less like confidence and more like deflection. It was a reminder that Washington is juggling crises while Ottawa is calmly executing long-term plans. Trump's non-answer was not a surprise. His trade posture for 2025 has been defined by unpredictability. Tariffs imposed overnight, negotiations frozen without explanation, and the looming threat, reported widely in the international press, that he may withdraw from USMCA in 2026. Canada, meanwhile, has moved in the opposite direction. Under Carney, Ottawa has entered one of its most disciplined phases of economic diplomacy in decades. Instead of waiting for clarity from Washington, Canada has been strengthening ties across Asia and Europe, widening trade channels with South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and the EU, while opening a controlled but pragmatic dialogue with China. Investors read that stability immediately. It is why companies like GM, Volkswagen, Vianode, and even Hyundai increasingly see Canada not as a backup to the U.S., but as a safer long-term base for major industrial operations. What's more, Carney's approach has signaled reliability to allies who are growing weary of Washington's volatility. While Trump shifts positions based on the politics of the moment, Canada has positioned itself as the steady, rules-based partner in a world hungry for predictability. That reputation has become an economic asset in itself, one that attracts capital, talent, and strategic partnerships that the U.S. can no longer take for granted. Trump offers uncertainty, Carney offers a roadmap. That contrast is reshaping how North American power actually works. When Trump dismissed Canadian production as something the U.S. doesn't need, he overlooked a crucial fact. American industry quite literally depends on it. U.S. refineries are engineered for Canadian heavy crude. Without it, they cannot operate efficiently, and no combination of American light crude or imports from Mexico and Venezuela can fill the gap. This year alone, Canada has supplied well over 2/3 of America's crude imports, a structural necessity, not a luxury. The same applies to aluminum. The United States does not produce enough for aerospace, defense, or large-scale manufacturing. Canadian aluminum remains the backbone of several American sectors, which is why the tariff spikes earlier this year caused turmoil not in Ottawa, but in U.S. factories. And in the new economy, EVs, batteries, chips, electrification, the dependency grows even sharper. Canada holds some of the most important critical mineral reserves in the Western world. Without Canadian nickel, copper, cobalt, and the infrastructure that transports them, the U.S. cannot meet its own energy transition targets. Major American automakers know this. GM, Ford, and Tesla all rely on Canadian components, Canadian materials, and Canadian energy. The White House may speak casually, but corporate America understands the supply chain math. So when Trump claims the U.S. doesn't need what Canada produces, it doesn't weaken Canada, it weakens the credibility of American trade policy. Trump's pivot from trade to hockey sounded harmless, but it revealed a deeper misreading of today's Canada. This is not a country defined by ice rinks. This is a country reshaping its industrial footprint and its geopolitical role simultaneously. Canada is in advanced talks with South Korea on submarine procurement, a move that would significantly expand its Arctic and Pacific capabilities. Nova Scotia is preparing one of the world's most ambitious offshore wind developments, a 66-gigawatt blueprint that could transform the entire eastern grid. British Columbia's North Coast transmission line is unlocking the Copper Belt, drawing global mining investment into a region that will define the next generation of electrification. And across Asia and Europe, Canada is building commercial relationships that dilute U.S. tariff risk and give Canadian exporters a wider stage. This is not the Canada of a decade ago. This is a Canada that stands as a middle power with real leverage, diplomatic, industrial, and strategic. Carney's government has leaned into that transformation. With the U.S. drifting through tariff politics and internal lawsuits, Canada has filled the vacuum with competence and direction. The contrast is impossible to ignore. This shift represents a broader redefinition of Canada's place in the world. No longer content to be viewed as America's quieter northern neighbor, Canada is asserting itself as a middle power with reach, leverage, and strategic assets that matter far beyond North America. And in doing so, Canada is proving that influence in the 21st century is built not through bluster, but through stability, predictability, and smart alliances. Trump's brief remarks at the Kennedy Center revealed more than he intended. His uncertainty, his misreading of supply chains, and his casual dismissal of a key ally underscore a fundamental shift in North America's balance of power. Canada is not waiting for Trump to restart negotiations. Canada is building a world where it doesn't need to. The United States can choose to re-engage seriously, or it can continue improvising. But the era when Washington dictated the terms is fading fast. Canada now has partners across the Pacific, industrial anchors across Europe, and energy projects at home that will reshape its economy for decades. So the closing question is simple. If Trump's answer is still "we'll see," then what exactly is the U.S. waiting for? Because Canada stopped waiting a long time ago.
With a review underway, the Swedish manufacturer of the Gripen jets is waiting in the wings.
I am wholeheartedly in favor of this. I have not been a proponent of the F-35 for Canada. It is so limited in terms of what Canada needs for long range, long sustainment, ease of operation, that the F-35 is simply out on the logistic and operational terms.
Canada just pulled off something no U.S. ally has ever dared to do to Donald Trump, and the impact is rippling across Washington. In a direct challenge to decades of American defense dominance, Ottawa is openly considering scrapping the U.S.-made F-35 and replacing it with Sweden's Gripen fighter jet. This is not a simple procurement story. It is a declaration of independence. It is Canada telling Trump's America, we decide our defense, not you. And for a president who has built his entire foreign policy playbook on forcing allies to buy American weapons, the symbolism could not be louder.
It's important for Canada to have sovereign capability in Canada to do their own upgrades, to build parts of it, to do final assembly and tests. We, as Saab, we are prepared to do that technology transfer to Canada and support that build-up.
The shift began quietly, but the facts are now unmistakable. Canada had committed to purchasing 16 F-35s with the option to expand to 88, a massive contract that aligned Canada squarely with the U.S. defense industry. But as a review moves forward, prominent Canadian defense analysts have declared the F-35 a mismatch for Canada's vast geography and Arctic missions. According to retired naval officer Ken Hansen, the American jet simply lacks the range, the endurance, and the practicality needed to patrol one of the largest airspaces in the world. And then came the news that has completely changed the conversation. Saab, the Swedish manufacturer of the Gripen, confirmed it has offered Canada something the United States never has: full technology transfer, domestic assembly, and complete sovereign control over upgrades and maintenance. Saab CEO Michael Johansson didn't shy away from specifics. He revealed that Canada could build major portions of the Gripen on its own soil. He pointed to IMP Aerospace in Nova Scotia as a potential assembly hub. He noted that Rolls-Royce, which supplies the new engine, is based in Montreal, and he stated plainly that the offer could generate as many as 10,000 high-skilled Canadian jobs. Suddenly, this is no longer just about replacing aircraft. It is about building a Canadian aerospace base powerful enough to serve global markets. Saab even confirmed that Gripen orders from other countries could be filled in Canada, meaning Canada would not only be manufacturing jets for itself, but potentially exporting them as well. With Sweden's King and Queen scheduled to visit Canada next week and Saab's leadership joining them, the political timing is impossible to ignore. This is becoming one of the biggest defense decisions Canada has faced in a generation. To understand why this move is so explosive, you have to place it inside the real-time political backdrop. Donald Trump is now deep into his second term as president. His administration continues to demand that allies prioritize American weapons above all else, claiming that U.S. hardware is the backbone of Western security. But Trump has also turned U.S.-Canada relations into a series of pressure campaigns. From tariffs on steel and automobiles to public comments about turning Canada into the 51st state to repeated threats against Canadian exporters, Trump's approach has strained the relationship to its core. Reuters recently reported that U.S.-Canada talks stalled again because Washington pushed for concessions Ottawa couldn't accept. So when Canada publicly questions the value of the F-35, the aircraft Trump uses as a symbol of American military dominance, it becomes more than a procurement debate. It becomes a political line drawn across the continent. It says Canada no longer feels obligated to satisfy Washington's expectations, and that alone is enough to send shockwaves through Trump's inner circle. The F-35 isn't just a jet, it is the United States' most powerful geopolitical anchor. Countries that buy it depend on American maintenance hubs, American software systems, American spare parts supply chains, and American political approval for every upgrade they make. Gripen is the exact opposite. It is built for countries that want autonomy. It is designed for rugged, remote air bases. It requires simpler logistics. It can be serviced domestically without waiting on U.S. approval. And Sweden is offering Canada the one thing the United States has never put on the table: full control over the aircraft's technology. For Canada, a country responsible for defending the Arctic, the North Atlantic approaches, and long-range sovereignty missions, the Gripen simply fits better. And Trump knows that if Canada breaks from the U.S. defense ecosystem, other allies may follow. That is why this decision is so politically sensitive. It chips away at Washington's long-standing monopoly over Western air power.
While American commentators will focus on geopolitics, the heart of this story lies in Canada's industrial future. If Ottawa greenlights Gripen production, this becomes one of the biggest job-creating aerospace expansions in modern Canadian history. Nova Scotia would become a manufacturing and assembly hub. Montreal would become a high-tech engine and systems center. And Canada would step onto the global stage not just as a buyer of advanced aircraft, but as a producer and exporter of them. This perfectly aligns with Prime Minister Mark Carney's emphasis on rebuilding Canada's long-term industrial capacity. Reuters has repeatedly described his economic strategy as a generational investment plan, one that strengthens key industries and reduces dependence on volatile U.S. policy swings. In that context, Gripen is not merely a jet. It is a blueprint for Canadian sovereignty, economic, technological, and strategic. Sweden's timing is striking. As a new NATO member, Stockholm is choosing this moment, under Trump's unpredictable second term, to tighten bonds with Canada. The fact that the King and Queen are traveling to Canada alongside Saab's leadership signals a deeper diplomatic calculation. This isn't just about sales. It is about aligning with a stable, reliable partner in North America. It is about diversifying NATO's industrial base beyond the United States, and it is about giving Canada the chance to become the only Gripen production hub outside Scandinavia, a distinction with massive geopolitical implications. Canada is now standing at a historic crossroads. The decision between the F-35 and the Gripen is no longer just about performance specs or budgets. It is about choosing whether Canada will continue renting its security from Washington or whether it will build its own sovereign aviation future. If Ottawa chooses Gripen, Donald Trump will not just lose a customer. He will lose a symbol of American dominance. And the world will see something new. A Canada confident enough to chart its own course, powerful enough to build its own fighter jets, and independent enough to say no, even to the President of the United States. The only question left is whether Canada will take the leap, because if it does, the aviation map of North America may never look the same again.
And that old world, the world in which APEC prospered, but also helped to foster, that old world of steady expansion of rules-based liberalized trade and investment, a world on which so much of our nation's prosperity, very much Canada's included, that world is gone. I think we have to be clear-eyed about that reality, because nostalgia is not a strategy.
At the 2025 APEC summit in South Korea, most speeches followed the familiar rhythm of global diplomacy, vague calls for cooperation and stability. Then Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke, and the tone shifted. That old world, he said, of steady expansion of rules-based liberalized trade and investment, that world is gone. It was a moment of quiet rupture. Carney was not simply describing change, he was announcing it. Canada, a nation often defined by proximity to American power, was signaling that it was done living in the shadow of Washington's playbook. His words carried the composure of a former central banker and the intent of a strategist who knew exactly what message he was sending. This was more than a speech. It was a manifesto for how middle powers survive in an age of economic nationalism. Carney's remarks stood apart from the usual APEC script. Instead of repeating phrases about open markets or shared prosperity, he warned that nostalgia was no longer a strategy. He told the room, quote, "We have to be clear-eyed about that reality. Nostalgia is not a strategy," end quote. The honesty hit differently. While others sidestepped the cracks in the global trade system, Carney confronted them directly. He described a turning point in world history as significant as the early 1990s, when APEC was born out of Cold War optimism. But this time, the forces reshaping the world were more complex: artificial intelligence, energy transition, and geopolitical fragmentation. By acknowledging that reality, Carney elevated Canada's position. The power of his message came from restraint. He did not dramatize the crisis, he clarified it. And in a hall full of leaders defending old habits, his realism sounded revolutionary. Carney's central idea was simple but profound. The global order that once relied on predictable, rules-based trade has collapsed. Our world, he said, is undergoing one of the most profound shifts since the fall of the Berlin Wall. For decades, countries assumed that global commerce was governed by institutions and norms that kept politics and economics apart. That assumption no longer holds. Tariffs, technology bans, and strategic export controls have become the new instruments of power. In acknowledging that shift, Carney was doing more than lamenting a lost system. He was defining Canada's role in what comes next. What comes next is ours to build, he said. At the core of this will be a partnership, a new partnership between government and business in service of our citizens. The line captured the essence of his vision: pragmatic cooperation instead of ideological confrontation. Canada would not wait for a new set of global rules, it would help write them.
We want to build big things with nations and companies who share our ambition and our belief that we are stronger together. So our government is charting a new course with an ambitious mission to double our non-US exports over the course of the next decade. And we're already making significant progress.
Carney's speech then moved from vision to execution. He laid out an ambitious strategy to diversify Canada's economy and redefined its alliances. "We are charting a new course," he said, "with an ambitious mission to double our non-US exports over the next decade." That mission is already in motion. Ottawa has signed new agreements with the United Arab Emirates on artificial intelligence and infrastructure, with the European Union on defense and trade, and with Germany on critical minerals. Negotiations with ASEAN are entering their final phase, while bilateral free trade talks with the Philippines and Thailand are set for next year. In South Korea, Carney announced something unprecedented: a new security and defense cooperation partnership, the first of its kind for Canada in the Indo-Pacific. The agreement expands into cyber, space, and hybrid threat cooperation, strengthening Canada's presence in a region where U.S. influence is being contested. Beneath these moves lies a foundation of energy and resources. By 2030, Canada will produce 50 million tons of LNG each year, all destined for Asian markets. By 2040, we will double that amount at least. Canada's grid is already 85% clean, and the government plans to increase that by half through nuclear and small modular reactors. In Toronto, Carney noted that Canada would soon announce over 20 new investment deals in critical minerals, totaling almost $2 billion of support. These are not small gestures. They are structural bets on the future of supply chains.
Throughout the address, Carney never mentioned the United States by name. He did not need to. Every sentence contrasted with Washington's current playbook. Certainty, he said, is the greatest currency in commerce. It was a statement aimed squarely at a trading system increasingly defined by unpredictability. Under President Trump, U.S. policy has become reactive, imposing tariffs, revising deals, and turning trade into a test of loyalty. For investors and allies, this constant recalibration has created doubt. Carney's Canada is positioning itself as the antidote to that volatility. "You crave in an uncertain world the certainty you deserve," he told the audience. His point was unmistakable. Canada offers what America no longer can: stability, reliability, and respect for the spirit of agreements, not just their letters. This was a diplomatic warning cloaked in optimism. If Washington continues to use economic coercion as a political tool, its allies will chart their own paths. And Ottawa is already leading the way through its outreach to Asia, partnerships in Europe, and resource diplomacy across the Indo-Pacific.
The deeper message of Carney's speech was about identity. Canada is redefining itself not as a dependent economy, but as a builder of trust in an unstable world. He described a nation rich in both resources and intellect. "We have more than 2 million STEM graduates," he said, "the most educated workforce in the world per capita." Canada's financial strength gives it leverage few realize. Its pension funds control roughly $3 trillion in capital, among the largest in the world. 40% of all listed mining companies are headquartered or listed in Canada, anchoring a global network of resource investment. Carney tied this capacity to a moral argument that Canada's advantage lies in doing business with integrity. Certainty comes not only from agreements, he said, but also from trust, from partners who respect the spirit and the values behind agreements. This was not just economic positioning, it was soft power reframed as industrial strategy. When Carney ended with the words, "Canada is ready to build the new architecture for trade and investment," it felt like both an invitation and a declaration.
He was offering an alternative model of power, quiet, consistent, and credible. His vision does not challenge Washington with confrontation, but with contrast. Where the U.S. measures strength in tariffs and leverage, Canada measures it in reliability and foresight. Carney's tone was not emotional, yet it stirred something deeper. The sense that smaller nations can still shape global systems if they act with purpose. The applause that followed was polite, but the message lingered long after. Canada had spoken not just to APEC, but to the world. The rules of trade are changing, and the nations that build trust will define the next era. And for Washington, Carney's message was unmistakable. The world is moving on, and this time Canada intends to lead the way.
You know, we're finding hundreds of billions of dollars of cash is pouring into our country now.
In Washington, the promise of America First was supposed to make the country stronger. Yet across the Pacific, that promise is falling apart. For months, President Donald Trump has pushed an aggressive campaign of reciprocal tariffs and cash-for-access trade deals. It worked at first, on paper, but now the two closest allies the United States has in Asia, Japan and South Korea, are quietly pulling away.
Our citizens were freed from America's arbitrary detention, but now the U.S. is pressuring us with tariffs despite the deal. When President Lee Jae-myung declared yesterday that he would not sign anything against national interests, the U.S. threatened either sign or pay the original 25% tariff instead of the agreed 15%.
And Japan's Economic Revitalization Minister, Rokse Akazawa, has stated that the broad trade agreement between Japan and the United States remains unsettled.
In Tokyo, frustration is building. In Seoul, anger has already erupted. These are not isolated tensions. They are the clearest signs that America's network of allies, built over decades of trust and shared prosperity, is beginning to fracture. What began as a show of strength is now turning into a global backlash. Trump's administration once bragged that its trade policies would bring in trillions of dollars. Instead, they are costing the U.S. billions in lost investment, broken trust, and diplomatic credibility. The story unfolding across Asia reveals how quickly friends can turn cautious and how a superpower can lose its footing when power becomes pressure. In Japan, the government's tone has shifted from optimism to unease. Tokyo's economic minister has said the trade agreement with the United States remains unsettled. While Washington reduced auto tariffs from 25% to 15%, the crucial orders covering pharmaceuticals and semiconductors are still missing. Without those, Japan insists there is no final deal. Behind the scenes, the dispute runs deeper. The U.S. is asking Japan for an investment package worth 550 billion yen to rebuild American industries in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and shipbuilding. For Washington, it is a strategy to restore manufacturing power. For Tokyo, it looks like a demand. Officials worry that paying billions up front to secure lower tariffs blurs the line between trade and tribute. Economists warn Japan could lose both leverage and independence in future negotiations. Even Japan's business leaders are uneasy. The deal lacks transparency, and no clear timeline has been provided. Tokyo's stance is careful but firm. Until all conditions are clarified, the agreement cannot be considered final. This hesitation is historic. It is the first time in decades that Japan has openly questioned the fairness of a U.S. trade arrangement. The uncertainty is delaying cross-border investments, and the political cost is mounting. For Japan, the risk is economic. For the United States, it is trust.
Okay. Well, let's get back into the Hyundai raid impact. And clearly, this was a pretty shocking event where the immigration policy of the Trump administration clashed with its desire to onshore investment. And I think that the reverberations are still playing out in terms of impact on Korean public opinion.
South Korea's response has been even sharper. In Seoul, the government is refusing to sign what it calls an unbalanced trade pact. President Lee Jae-myung has said publicly that he will not approve any deal that works against Korea's national interest. The United States reacted within hours, warning that if Seoul refuses to sign, the tariffs on Korean goods will revert from the reduced 15% back to the original 25%. This ultimatum has been described inside Korea as a financial threat, not a negotiation. The deal in question includes a $350 billion investment commitment demanded by Washington. The structure, distribution, and profit sharing would all be dictated by U.S. terms. For many Koreans, that crosses a line. Tensions deepened after a high-profile incident in Georgia earlier this year when U.S. immigration authorities raided a Hyundai plant under construction. The operation disrupted technical teams flown in from Korea to help start production, and was seen by Korean media as a humiliation. Economists now warn that the raid has created lasting uncertainty about America's reliability as an investment destination. Korean officials and analysts describe a growing trust deficit. Even as Korean companies expand shipbuilding, battery, and auto operations in the United States, they are quietly reviewing new projects or delaying them altogether. Observers note that the U.S. government's own agencies appear uncoordinated, trade policy pulling one way, immigration enforcement pulling another. That inconsistency is making investors nervous. In trade terms, Korea remains one of America's largest partners, exporting tens of billions of dollars in vehicles and electronics each year. But with tariffs, visa disruptions, and unpredictable rules, the confidence that once defined the alliance has eroded. What was once cooperation now feels like coercion, and what used to be loyalty is turning into resistance. The shockwaves from Asia are spreading far beyond the Pacific. In Canada, the same tensions are taking hold. Since early 2025, Canadian exports have faced a 25% tariff on most goods and a 10% levy on energy. Ottawa retaliated before scaling back to keep talks alive. Prime Minister Mark Carney is now seeking tariff relief, but Washington's stance remains unchanged. Lower tariffs will come only with major financial commitments inside the United States. It is the same pattern seen in Japan and Korea, relief offered only if the partner country pays first. Yet this model is collapsing. Instead of drawing more money into the U.S., it is driving allies to diversify away from it. In Asia, both Japan and Korea are expanding trade ties through the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Europe is deepening free trade with ASEAN and Latin America. Canada is building stronger bridges with the EU and Indonesia to offset U.S. pressure. Analysts estimate that the combined shift of Japanese, Korean, and Canadian capital away from the U.S. could redirect hundreds of billions of dollars in investment over the next 3 years. These are funds once destined for American factories and shipyards, now flowing to more predictable markets. Washington's credibility as a reliable partner is under strain. Allies are voicing doubts about the future of U.S.-led trade. The message from capitals across the world is clear: partnerships cannot survive if they are built on threats. For Trump, the optics are stark. The strategy designed to show American strength is leaving the U.S. more isolated. Allies in Asia and North America are rewriting their playbooks, forming new alliances that bypass Washington altogether. As Canada prepares for another round of talks, its negotiators are watching Tokyo and Seoul closely. Both countries stood firm and paid the price. Now Ottawa faces the same choice: comply and risk sovereignty, or resist and face tariffs that hurt domestic industries. Across the world, the cash for relief experiment is revealing its true cost. The United States has not gained the trillions once promised. It has lost billions in credibility, in investment, and in goodwill.
From Tokyo to Seoul to Ottawa, the pattern is unmistakable. Trump's trade doctrine began as a rallying cry for American revival. But as the demands grew heavier and the deals became one-sided, that doctrine began to unravel. In Japan, the deal remains unfinished. In Korea, trust is fading. In Canada, talks are stalling. Each step meant to secure dominance has pushed America's partners further away. The final image is not one of triumph, but of isolation, a superpower surrounded by allies who no longer feel like friends. America First, once meant to rebuild national strength, now risks turning into something else entirely: America alone.